Well, it's pretty obvious at this point that, there is no way Ukraine wins this war.
But do you really think it's fair to ask Ukraine to sit at the kids' table while the adults talk?
This conflict has not been about Ukraine specifically. It's been rather about Ukraine in the context of Moscow relationship with the West. Donald Trump is acting in his own interest, and I'm pretty sure Moscow understands that very, very clearly. He became president promising that he will resolve the Ukraine crisis, right? He obviously doesn't want to end up being a loser here. The US have some other agenda these days, or some other things to take care of. Maybe China. It doesn't have to be NATO or European peacekeepers, it could be somewhere else.
Who else?
Well, there are plenty of countries, I don't know, in
Could you name
Africa,
some?
in South Asia. Europe is now taking a very militaristic, very jingoistic approach to the conflict. I would expect New Delhi to be taking a very active approach in the, on the international arena.
It's been 3 years since the Russia-Ukraine war began, the worst war in Europe since World War II. It has uprooted millions and killed thousands on both sides. With Donald Trump in the White House now, geopolitics and diplomacy are changing swiftly. But the big question is if it will finally be the end of the war. To discuss this and much more, Ruslan Imaev is joining me here in the studio. He's a senior editor at Russia Today, and he joins us. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and doing this with me.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, Ruslan, it's been 3 years of the war, as I just said, and I want to ask you, would you have imagined if we were sitting in February 2022, we were sitting here, would you imagine the way the war panned out, it would have been like that?
Well, I would say we are more or less in the similar process now that we could have had as early as 2022 as well. If you remember back in the day, the sides were very close to signing an agreement actually with the mediation of the Turkish officials, and in Istanbul the parties almost signed a document that was satisfactory to both sides, but then Ukraine chose to effectively withdraw from the negotiations, and as we understand now, judging by the statements from various officials, it's been under pressure from the United Kingdom or some of the Western countries. And well, let's put it this way, this 3 years of war could have been avoided had those agreements been signed straight away.
All right, let's go back to the start again. There were a few goals listed by the Russian president when he had launched the war against Ukraine, and one of those was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Do you think that has been achieved?
Very much will depend on the final configuration or the shape of the peace deal or the agreement that we will have, that we'll see maybe this year. And it probably is more important what will be decided between Washington and Moscow rather than between Moscow and Kiev at this point, because we need to understand that for Russia this conflict has not been about Ukraine specifically. It's been rather about Ukraine in the context of Moscow relationship with the West. So when people say that Putin wants to, overthrow Zelensky, do some land grab, that's nonsense. People do not then understand what the conflict is really about. For Russia, it's been about NATO and NATO expansion to the east and the complete disregard for Russia's strategic interest, right? So Moscow, or rather NATO, moving eastward and making Ukraine part of NATO's military infrastructure posed an existential threat for Russia. So that's the core of the issue. And this is what I'm saying. What's happening now is way more important than this potential negotiation between Moscow and Kiev here. We need to have some sort of an understanding reached between Moscow and Washington first. And this is exactly what's happening now in Riyadh.
All right, since you say all of that, what are the other kind of ambitions Russia was looking for in Ukraine, and how much of it do you think has been achieved in the last 3 years?
I would say, again, let me put it this way. There are different layers of conflict in Ukraine, right? So the first one, what it started with initially was the inner Ukraine conflict between the eastern part of the country and the rest of the country, the Kiev and the western part, right? So the east of the country was populated by the people who spoke Russian language, who, let me put it this way, identified themselves as Russian nationals and who felt threatened by the policies of the rest of the country. And as we've seen in 2014, they've come under attack from Kiev and Kiev forces. So that was one of the goals of Russia, to actually secure and protect the population that Russia or Russian people related to, and both the people of the east of Ukraine back then, now it's part of Russia, could relate to, right? Now we know that these territories are officially part of Russia, and these people are secured and their well-being is secured as well, on the one hand. On the other, the main goal was to demilitarize Ukraine and not to allow Ukraine to become part of NATO, and to allow the NATO military infrastructure to be installed in Ukraine. How that go, we will only see, and we will only be able to tell after the negotiations are finished. I would assume that this will be one of the key issues for Moscow when it comes to its negotiations with the West, some sort of a neutral status for Ukraine.
You use the word secure, that Russia sees that the eastern part of Ukraine, where the people live, are secure now. Obviously, Ukraine doesn't see it like that. There are about 3.7 million people who have been internally displaced, 6.9 million globally displaced, 2 million children in need of humanitarian assistance. So when Russia says that it doesn't want to grab lands, as you said, and in fact, that brings me to the point when the Russian president was addressing to the nation on February 24th in 2022, he said something, and I'm quoting, "Our plan do not include the occupation of Ukrainian territories. We are not going to impose anything on anyone by force, pardon me on that." So when we hear these kind of statements, but at the same time Russia is refusing to retreat from the land of the Ukrainians, because that's 18.5% of Ukrainian land where Russia sits. Why is that? Where is the gap?
We've seen the referendums held in these parts of territories of former Ukraine, where the majority of people voted in favor of joining Russian Federation, in favor of security.
But how is it that you're saying that the referendum was done, people voted in favor of Russia, but so many people have been displaced, people left the war and moved towards westwards? If people wanted this, why were they fleeing?
Well, again, as I've said initially, all of the 3 years of conflict could have been really easily avoided, and we would have seen a completely different configuration of the situation on the ground now had those agreements in Istanbul been signed.
All right. There is so much talk about the peace deal in Ukraine, isn't there? You've been constantly referring to it as well. How likely should we expect it, and how soon?
We would see, it's obviously a fluid process, the diplomatic negotiations, and obviously the sides come with positions. We accept that, we don't accept that, we want this, we don't want that, right? Behind those positions are the interests, right? So the peace process that addresses the interests of the countries that kind of are behind those positions will eventually, I believe, end up in a solution, in a resolution that will be sustainable and that can be called long-lasting, right? I'm very much impressed by the way the Trump administration moved with kickstarting this diplomatic process. They've moved to the very core issue behind this conflict from Moscow's position, which is again the relationship between Moscow and Washington DC, right? They sidelined Europe, they sidelined Kiev for the time being, as far as I'm concerned, right? Because that allowed them to avoid all the unnecessary back and forth, all the unnecessary details for now. We moved to laying the groundwork for further negotiations when it comes to the Ukraine conflict that will eventually move to something more, issue-based, something that will be more specific to the conflict. Right now, it is about figuring out the relationship between Moscow and Washington. This is the most important thing that we can observe happening.
I sat down with Ambassador John Bolton recently, and we were talking about Trump's peace plan. We obviously don't know exactly what it's going to entail, but the things that we have been hearing so far in the past few weeks. And he says that this is a peace plan that could have been written in Kremlin.
Well, many people say these days that, you know, that Trump is acting in Moscow's interest. I think President Putin was also addressing that, and he said it. That's a complete nonsense, to be honest. Trump is, well, following his own interest or his vision of what's the American interest these days, even if it's different from what the previous administration or previous Trump administration even thought about it. Obviously, the US have some other agenda these days or some other things to take care of. Maybe China, I don't know. On the other hand, we do know how much, how important this kind of public and PR issue, PR part of it is for Donald Trump, right? So he became president promising that he will resolve the Ukraine crisis, right? He obviously doesn't want to end up being a loser here when it comes to the crisis. And it's pretty obvious at this point that, you know, there is no way Ukraine wins this war. There is no way that if US continues to support militarily Ukraine, Trump does not end up being a loser. So right now, he moved in to actually become one of the winners of the situation, right? If he actually manages to restore peace or restore some sort of relationship with Moscow at this point, in my opinion, that's Nobel Peace Prize.
Speaking of your opinion, I understand why Russia sees the peace deal in their favor. It's almost everything that they wanted. But do you really think it's fair to ask Ukraine to sit at the kids' table while the adults talk, that US and Russia is talking? But Ukraine is very much part of the conflict, right? That is exactly where the conflict is.
The main issue is to ensure the neutrality of some sort of Ukraine for Moscow, in my opinion. Again, we don't know what the peace plan or what the peace agreement will look like ultimately. If those issues are addressed, I believe Moscow will be ready to accommodate some other demands. As far as I understand, as much like as I've mentioned already, it's more about interests rather than positions ultimately that matter in this kind of negotiations, right? So obviously, I'm pretty sure some of the Ukraine's interests will be also addressed ultimately. For now, it's more about Washington and Moscow, in my opinion.
All right. One statement came in from Turkey yesterday, and I'm quoting, "We are in favor of Ukraine to be a NATO member, but we have to be realistic. Ukrainians are asking for NATO membership, not just for the sake of being a NATO member. It's a security guarantee for their own country." Now, Ankara is one that's actually very close to Moscow and has been kind of a middleman in this entire conflict. How do you assess this statement?
We've heard from the American officials already now that it's probably not happening, Ukraine becoming part of NATO, so we'll have to figure out some other configuration where Ukraine's interest and Ukraine's security is, well, guaranteed by some other countries. I've heard some talk among the US expert circles that it could be the United Kingdom, who would be the guarantor of the peace or guarantor of security for Ukraine. We'll have to wait and see. One thing I know, and there is a certain contradiction here between Moscow and Washington. Donald Trump a few days ago mentioned, I think it was the day before yesterday, right? He mentioned that he believes Putin will accept the idea of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. And Moscow's position towards that has been quite consistent. Moscow has been saying no NATO troops, regardless of what you call it, right? European troops, NATO troops. But again, fluid process. So we can, you know, and I'm speculating here. I'm really just throwing things in here. I don't know. I don't have any inside knowledge about that, but could be other peacekeepers, right? It could not. It doesn't have to be NATO or European peacekeepers. Could be somewhere else.
Who else?
Well, there are plenty of countries, I don't know, in Africa, in South Asia, who are sort of contributing to the UN peacekeeping forces. Could be one of those. Again, no inside knowledge. I'm very much speculating here.
All right. About 2 days ago, the Russian president put out a statement. He was talking about this probable agreement in terms of defense with the US. He also mentioned China, and you mentioned China earlier. Could I just play that for you?
Sure.
We could reach an agreement with the U.S. on cutting defense budgets. We have no objections. I think it's a good idea. The U.S. would reduce it by 50%, and we would reduce it by 50%. And China could join later if it wishes. We believe this is a good proposal, and we are ready for discussions on this matter.
Could you explain that for us?
Well, I think if we go into the actual defense issue, the defense question, so many foundational core agreements that have been reached post-Cold War between the US and Russia has been dismantled in the last years. So that will be a very, very long way ahead to restore some of those status quo in the military balance between the nations, two of the biggest nuclear powers, right? So that will be quite a big process happening. Obviously, it's a very, very long way to go there. At the same time, it might be the very same issue that happens with the minerals, right? So you've heard President Trump saying that he's eager to explore the possibility of some sort of agreement with Russia as well on rare earth, after President Putin came forward saying that, you know, that we do have large resources as well. Both sides, I believe, are now actually actively probing each other to see how far they can take it now, right? So when President Putin, for instance, comes forward and says, we actually have quite a lot of rare earth minerals as well, and we would be ready to discuss it, it's a way to, in my opinion, it's a way to signal Washington that any sort of normalcy in relations, in trade, in cooperation, is better than confrontation. So let's see where we can go to, what we can reach together. Maybe this kind of statement is also part of that process of probing, suggesting, seeing where they can take it.
And where does China fit in this?
I would say, again, I'm not privy to the internal thinking of the Kremlin on this one, but I would assume that because we are now obviously moving from this relationship or the world order where you have the two of the largest military powers, Russia and the United States, right? It's not just them being the military superpowers. China is also joining in. India is also likely to join in at some point. So the potential for reconfiguration of this status quo is huge there, right? So obviously President Putin needs to mention that as well, because China will be a major player in this regard as well. And we do know that the US administration has a lot of concerns when it comes to China's growing power.
Exactly. I'm trying to imagine it. US is trying to strike a deal with Russia. At the same time, Russia is trying to piggyback that no, China will also come in. How is that going to look?
Again, as I've said, with Donald Trump, when he is making deals with Russia, we should not be. Again, I would assume Moscow is being very cautious here when it comes to, you know, rebuilding ties with Washington D.C. It's a very long way to go, right? So when Donald Trump moves to deal with Russia, it does not mean that he actually, I don't know, follows suit or acts in Russia's interest. No, Donald Trump is acting in his own interest, and I'm pretty sure Moscow understands that very, very clearly. So, for instance, when we talk about Russia's relationship with China, with Iran, I would think that Moscow will be on the very cautious side to, you know, realign or treat its rapprochement as it with the US at the expense of its old trusted partnerships. Let me put it this way. I wouldn't say that much of that will change in at least in the next years.
All right. Ruslan, you mentioned the rare earth minerals, right? I understand that Europe has kind of been sidelined by the US, especially the kind of talks we are seeing in the past few weeks. Europe still strongly believes that whatever compensation that the US or Europe, if at all they are supposed to get from Ukraine, it shouldn't be coming from Ukraine, it should be coming from Russia, because they are the quote-unquote aggressor. That's what the French president just called it. How is Moscow viewing this?
I think in this regard, the processes and the votes happening at the UN are quite telling. Just in the last couple of days, we've seen quite a significant shift and change with United States and actually Israel as well, voting against the resolution put forward by Europe and Ukraine and Europe, which had some very strong language there, condemning Russia, which Russian side considers as actually anti-Russian resolution. In this way, the vote is quite telling. The majority, no, let me reword it. It's the least supported resolution of the current session, as the Russian Foreign Ministry puts it. That is a remarkable demonstration that the world is now demanding peace, actually, right? So the world is ready to, the majority of the countries want this conflict to end. Europe, at this point, its vote at the UN, its public statements at this point are raising eyebrows. Europe is now taking a very militaristic, very jingoistic approach to the conflict. On the one hand, it does show to me, from my personal perspective, that Europe has been failing to understand what's in the core of this crisis, because again, in their opinion, Putin will invade Poland, Putin will invade the Baltic states, Putin will invade, I don't know, some other countries. It's not about that. Nothing of that is in the interest of Moscow. Moscow officials have been consistently saying that they are super eager to build a productive and constructive relationship with the European countries, right? It's been the issue of security for Russia.
But you can't take that at face value, right? Can you?
Well, obviously.
I mean, at what point Russia said it did not want any territories of Ukraine. Now it is controlling 18.5% of it.
Well, obviously, it's up to you and up to any of the other experts to evaluate and to give opinions about each country's positions in this regard. What I'm talking about here is that, well, on the one hand, Europe has this opinions and this perspective on the crisis. On the other hand, it does look like Europe has been very much sidelined and is very much lagging behind. I would say Europe actually fails to read the room at this point, because they've been so very much heavily invested in this Ukraine crisis, supporting Ukraine following suit of the US initially, right? And then they just now, when the US approach to the conflict completely changed, they just fail to react timely to that, and they just continue pushing with this narrative, which is absolutely not helpful. And this is, again, in Moscow words, in the words of the Moscow's foreign ministry, just demonstrates that Europe at this point should not be sitting at the negotiating table.
Also, there are two things. I think you rightly pointed out that Moscow is being very cautious with what kind of deal it makes with Trump, or what kind of talks it happens, or the negotiations per se. The other thing is that, as you said, Trump is peddling his own interests here. We have to keep that in mind. It's also Trump's last term. Legally, he cannot stay in the White House after the 4 years. So when Moscow is being cautious and it knows there could be another administration in the next 4 years that might not toe the same line as Trump, what does that tell us about the future of geopolitics?
I would say, I've mentioned it somewhere else, that we are now observing some very core changes to the very structure of international relations, right? So the post-Cold War status quo that was built, the Western foreign policy that was built on these ideas developed by Tony Blair and Clinton, this kind of ideological, pro-democracy, democracy pushing, democracy installing foreign policy, has now come to an end. And again, as I've mentioned, some of the very core and foundational agreements between the superpowers have been dismantled. So we will be seeing some post-Ukraine war international relations system built. It will address, obviously, the relationship between Russia and the US, Russia and Europe, Europe and Washington as well, the relationship between Europe as well. Europe will actually have to reassess what it's doing, because, again, in the words of the esteemed US scholar Jeffrey Sachs a couple of days ago, at the moment, it does not look like Europe has a meaningful foreign policy of its own. It just follows suit of what the US is doing, really, right? So they will obviously have to reassess all of those things. But again, and I'm no strategist, I'm not geopolitical strategist at this point. I cannot, it's also speculation to a certain extent. But I would say that the core dynamics that happens in the world these days will definitely persist and remain. And I'm talking about the rise of importance of Africa, of South Asia, India, China, the economic relationship between all those, the majority of the world actually that is being heard more these days. This will definitely persist.
All right. Ruslan, we are sitting in New Delhi. Let's talk about India and Russia's ties. What do you think? What's next for it?
It's obviously been quite an interesting configuration of relationship between Moscow, New Delhi, and Washington DC, right? And we can only appreciate New Delhi's very calculated and very pragmatic approach to handling and managing its relationship. Because, as we know, as we see, India is now ready to take up a bigger, larger role of being an important global power, and then with this comes this approach that India can act in its own interest and put its own interest and the interest of its own people at the forefront of its foreign policy and its diplomacy. At the same time, New Delhi has been instrumental in, well, I wouldn't say that, in the words of Foreign Minister Jaishankar, right? New Delhi is not offering anything in the sense of, actual peace plan. It's not that they're actually formulating the document and bringing it to the sides, to Washington, to Moscow, and to Kiev. But if you pay attention, Prime Minister Modi was one of the very, very few world leaders who went both to Moscow and to Kiev during this crisis. This has been essential, in my opinion, in actually, some messaging, some sort of process, some sort of talks, because this is what matters in the end. You need to talk. You need to be able to convey some certain, signaling and messaging as well there. So this is very, very much appreciated. So in this regard, when it comes to Moscow's relationship with New Delhi, obviously some of the pressure will be lifted, and so we can. Once, obviously, the agreements will be signed and some sort of a peace plan will be hammered out finally. And in this way, I would say we can only expect some further fruitful cooperation between the nations.
Do you think we will see more of these kind of balancing acts that New Delhi has been doing in the new world order we keep talking about?
If I understand India's foreign policy correctly, and if I understand the words of the Indian officials correctly, India is now stipulating that the end of this is not the time for the conflict. This is the era of peace. This is the era of cooperation between the nations. In this way, I would expect New Delhi to be taking a very active approach in the, on the international arena to actually, bring some sort of harmony in the relationship between the nations, which is particularly important these days.
All right, Ruslan, that is the end of the interview. Those are the only questions I had. Thank you so much for speaking with me, and it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.